Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland. Congresswoman, I really appreciate you taking the time this morning.
Well, thank you for having me.
In the wake of the school shooting last week in Nashville that killed 3 children and 3 adults, you, along with your colleagues, Representatives Elissa Slotkin, Mark Takano, and Senator Ed Markey, reintroduced the Gun Violence Prevention Research Act. Can you tell us about the legislation?
Well, thank you for the question and thanks for having me on. What this legislation does is it makes a declaration that gun violence is a public health emergency, and it directs the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, to really put some time into researching the root causes of gun violence. And when we talk about gun violence, we typically think of it from a sociological standpoint, but this is going to use sociology, psychology, data, and science, and really dig into what motivates people to commit gun violence, who is committing it, and just coming up with things that we can do to try and prevent it.
You've said before, and you just said now, that this will really look into the root causes of gun violence. Can you pull back the curtain a little bit and give us some insight? How specifically would the legislation do that?
Well, I mean, I think the legislation will be very, very specific because, well, first of all, we have not declared this a national public health crisis, so it needs adequate resources. And so this will direct the CDC to spend $50 million per year over a 5-year period to really do some in-depth research and just trying to find out, what motivates people, what are some of the demographic profiles of who commits gun violence, what motivates them, why are they doing it, and really, getting deep into the root causes of it. Now, is this legislation alone going to eliminate all gun violence? Absolutely not. But what we often have are these very tragic, high-profile events. And when you hear people talking about school children not being safe in the one place they should be safe, it's just well past time to take action.
You said it's not enough to prevent gun violence, and according to the Gun Violence Archive, there have been 139 mass shootings this year to date. And Congresswoman, we are not live right now, so by the time this video does get published, that number could very well increase. This is a problem that affects every community. So what else needs to be done aside from this legislation to put an end to this mass shooting cycle?
Well, when we think about mass shootings, we often look at the types of weapons that are used and how they are acquired. And so we know that, we are trying to pass things in the House right now to address the access to semi-automatic weapons or weapons of war that are meant to kill large numbers of people very quickly. Those things should not be on the streets. Civilians should not own those. So that's one thing to look at. And then also, too, just looking at, sadly, when we look at who commits these mass shootings, they tend to be male and they tend to be younger. And so what is going on with these young men in America where they think that this is how you solve a problem or how you resolve being embarrassed or being rejected? And so I think there's just a lot of psychology, a lot of data, and even science to try to determine, what's going on with these people. But, there are two parts to this: the people who commit the gun violence and the fact that there are more guns than there are people in the United States. And in addition to people who legally buy guns and do exactly what we ask them to do, we know that there is an underground gun market where people are either stealing guns or they're getting them illegally. So it's really taking a completely comprehensive approach to see what we can do to reduce gun violence in the United States.
You broke it down into two parts: the people themselves who commit the gun violence, as well as the guns themselves. So let's talk about the people first. Republicans and Democrats alike have said that there's a mental health crisis in this country, especially when it pertains to gun violence. Senator Markey, yourself, as well as Representatives Slotkin and Takano are all Democrats. What has the Republican response been to your legislation?
The Republican response to having any discussion about common sense gun violence has been pretty disappointing. Now, we did pass a suite of bills in the last Congress around safety, trying to really look at public safety and dealing with mental health and trying to do some things to help people. But what Republicans seem to be afraid to do is really take those big steps. And here's what's so interesting. Addressing gun violence in a comprehensive way is wildly popular with the public across all party lines. And so as you see the effectiveness of the NRA start to dilute, as more and more children die in gun violence, places of worship, going to concerts, going to the grocery store, All those things that we routinely do in daily life in the United States have now put us on alert. And so we have to really think about, are we serious about taking action? Are we going to do the research and come up with policies that keep everyone safe? This is a conversation about safety, and sometimes it turns into guns and the Second Amendment. This is about communities that are safe, and that is something that everyone should want and everyone deserves in this country.
The suite of bills you were describing is the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Some Republicans did support it, but do you think overall that's as far as Republicans are willing to go when it comes to gun control legislation?
Well, when I talk about how far Republicans are willing to go, the question is really how many Republicans who, if they could vote by secret ballot, would vote and do the right thing. The margin in the House right now between Democrats and Republicans, 4 votes. So I really do believe that there are probably a dozen or more Republicans who, if they could vote by secret ballot, would vote for common sense gun reform and would vote for this study that we want the CDC to do to really look at gun violence as a public health crisis. The question is, are they going to be afraid of these big, powerful lobbies or a handful of people who are vocal? Or are they serious about public safety and protecting our children?
You said that they would vote by secret ballot if they could, but they can't. So what more can Democrats do? Because Senator Chris Murphy this weekend said that they don't have the votes in the Senate to pass an assault weapons ban. So aside from this legislation, what else can your party do?
I think this is just one of those issues that we continue to speak about. I'm here in the district right now in Washington State in the 10th district, and I've been going to a lot of events, and my events are about a lot of topics, but gun violence comes up in every single conversation. And I don't know if you saw the clip over this weekend, but there was a coach from Georgia Tech, and he was doing a press conference, and he was talking about sports, but he actually pivoted and talked about needing to take action on gun violence. He talked about having a 4-year-old daughter. He was in tears. And so I think the thing that we can do as Democrats is continue to listen to the majority of the American people who want us to take action.
A criticism that lawmakers receive is that calls for gun control legislation happen only immediately after a mass shooting, and then they subside fairly quickly. The Nashville shooting happened less than 2 weeks ago, and already the news cycle has shifted to former President Trump's arraignment. Is this legislation still a top priority for Democrats?
This legislation will remain a top priority for Democrats, and you are absolutely right. We have a large, high-profile, tragic event around guns. It becomes top of the news cycle. People express their hopes and prayers and wishes and condolences, which are completely legitimate, and then it recedes out of the news cycle. And I want to remind folks, too, that the high-profile mass shootings are horrific and happen far too often to the point where we're desensitized. But people die in America from gun violence every single day as well. And so there's the high profile part of it that affects children, sadly, but there's also the fact that people die from gun violence every day in America. And so again, this is a public health crisis. It needs to be treated as such. And we need to empower the Centers for Disease Control to do the research that we can have fact-based, scientific-based solutions to try and address this uniquely American problem.
I was talking to your colleague, Representative Greg Landsman, last week about the Nashville shooting, and he called for an assault weapons ban, but he said that needs to even be a step further and get those types of weapons out of the country. Is that something that you agree with?
Realistically, they should not be anywhere in the country in the hands of civilians. But I think that, as a lawmaker, we have to be very intentional about where we can get wins. And so what I say to folks is, let's take the wins where we can get them. Let's pass legislation that's going to keep people safe. And then as we proceed, let's just continue to build on it. And look at the example in Australia. I don't know how long ago it was, but they had a mass shooting take place. They got rid of automatic and semi-automatic weapons, and they haven't had one since. And so we can't deny that common sense gun laws will save lives. But we have to have the courage and the conviction to ask ourselves as lawmakers, are we going to protect the American people or aren't we? Are we going to be afraid of large lobbies and a group of loud voices, or are we going to put people first? That's always going to be the question we have to ask ourselves. And as a Democrat, we will always put the safety of people first.
Going back to your legislation, what's next for the Gun Violence Prevention Research Act?
So we do have some co-sponsors already, and we're just going to continue to try to build on it. We're going to talk about it in the press. We're going to make sure it's part of our platform as we go into the next election cycle. But again, listening to the people. This has widespread support. It is not just a partisan issue. But I think the question is, are the Republicans going to have the courage to step up and do what they know is the right thing? I mean, you talk about public safety all the time, and this is one way to improve safety and to reduce the number of mass shootings and just to keep our communities more safe.
And let's say, hypothetically speaking, that this legislation was signed into law tomorrow. How fast would it take to implement it, and how long would that research take?
Well, I mean, the good news is that this has a substantive amount of funding to go with it. And so the CDC can employ large numbers of people and really get to research right away. And in the meantime, as legislators, we will continue to try and pass the laws that haven't gotten past the Senate. But I think it's something that doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens concurrently. We are discussing gun violence. We're doing what we can to get, illegal guns off the streets. We're trying to pass laws, and at the same time, the CDC will do its research. So it's not an either or, it's a yes and. We continue to do this work in a very comprehensive way.
Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland, I appreciate you coming on.